Hello, everyone. My name is Sam, and I'm going to be your host for today. Welcome to Reptile and Amphibian Days, and today we get to be a vet with Dr. Ashley Emanuel. We have captions for today's program, and we've pinned the link that has those captions. They'll open in a separate window or tab, so you can click on that if you need closed captions. And this program is being recorded and will be posted to our Reptile and Amphibian Days homepage. If you want to check back and rewatch the program, you can do that. If you have any questions, please type them in chat, and we'll be answering them either in chat or aloud if we have time. And with that, I am excited to introduce our speaker. Dr. Ashley Emanuel graduated veterinary school from NC State and quickly became North Carolina's first certified aquatic veterinarian while working at avian and exotic animal care in Raleigh. She's passionate about science communication, fostering connections with her clients, and of course, the medicine of slimy, scaly, and swimmy creatures. Thanks so much for speaking with us today, Ashley, and I'll let you take it from here.
Thank you so much for having me, Sam, and welcome and hello to everyone watching. I'm so happy you're here and that we're going to learn how to be a veterinarian for salamanders today. The first most important thing that we can do is figure out what our Hellbender nickname is. Hellbenders are really cool. They're North America's largest salamander, and we have one right here at the museum in Raleigh. So next time you visit, make sure you go to the dark, shady spot on the third floor all the way in the back and say hi to him. He'll probably be under a rock. For now, though, you can call me Dr. Blotch Beast. Today, you get to be the vet. So what we're going to talk about today is what in the world even are amphibians? And if you've tuned in at all this past week for Reptile and Amphibian Days, you should know how to answer that question already. Can we really keep them as pets? And how do we take care of them as veterinarians? In order to be a good veterinarian, we have to understand who's our patient, figure out what's wrong with them, and then figure out how we help. So I need you all to put on your thinking caps because we have a very important job today. What in the world are amphibians? We know that they're not lizards. We know that they're not snakes. They're a whole group on their own. Amphibians are a cold-blooded vertebrate class that comprises frogs, toads, newts, and salamanders. The big thing that makes them amphibians is that they have two separate life stages, one of which is in the water and breathes with gills, and then the other usually lives on land and uses lungs to breathe. They're divided into three major groups. Anura is our first group, and Anura means without tail in Greek, which makes sense because this is the group that includes toads and frogs. If you think about it, the name doesn't make too much sense because when they're tadpoles, they all have tails, but as adults, they go away. Frogs and toads have long hind limbs that fold underneath them, the better to help them spring away from us. And they have short forelimbs, webbed toes with no claws, no tails, and really big eyes with glandular, moist skin. It's not a perfect rule, but in general, frogs have smooth skin and toads have warty skin. So if you're out and you're meeting some frogs and toads, you want to make a good guess. If they're bumpy, it's a toad. If it's smooth, it's a frog. Caudata is our next group, and that comes from Latin just meaning tail. So just like Anura doesn't have a tail, Caudata does have a tail. This includes the salamanders and the newts. They also include the Japanese giant salamander and our friend, the hellbender. These guys don't have claws. They have scale-free skin and tails that are usually flattened from side to side. Usually those tails have some fins even all the way on the end. If you're looking at my little video, you can also see that this group includes the axolotls, which are very cute. And all the way at the end of this video, you're going to see a bright orange little newt right there. That's called an eft. And an eft is the baby of, and I guess it's not the baby of a newt, but it's when a newt is a baby, they're called an eft. The last group are these guys. So their name comes from the Greek meaning a naked serpent, and they're comprised entirely of the caecilians. The caecilians are long, cylindrical, limbless, and live really deep underground. They have really rudimentary eyes, but because they live underground, they don't really need to see anything. So those eyes are covered in skin. These guys are great if you've wanted a giant and really complicated earthworm for a pet, but they still don't do really well in captivity. Today, we're mostly going to be talking about caudata, which is the salamanders, and axolotls. So I have a question for you, and Sam can get back to me about your answers, but what kind of amphibian do you think would be the most fun to be a veterinarian for? And I've gotten to work with almost all of these. Some of my favorites are the little green frogs, the Pac-Man frogs with their huge mouths, and the axolotls I think are really cute too. So if you have any opinions and you want to share them, now's the time to do it.
Yeah, I know for me, I would definitely say the axolotls because they are so cool. I love them.
They always look like they're smiling.
Yes, definitely. Yeah, and those little external gills on the sides of their face are always like so cute. Yes. So in the chat, we have a lot of people sharing their Hellbender names. As far as things, we have Slime Beast in chat, Snot Puppy, mine is Marsh Devil. And we have Swamp Beast as well. So that's awesome. Thank you so much for sharing those.
You're welcome.
Oh, and Swamp Urchin. How could I forget?
Oh, welcome, Dr. Swamp Urchin and friends.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. But yeah, in the chat, they're saying Salamander would be a great one to work with. Axolotl as well, seconding those axolotls. So yeah, we have a lot of love for the Salamander family already.
Well, that's perfect. That's what we're all here for, right?
Yeah.
Good answers, guys. So we're moving on. Can we even keep amphibians as pets? And I bet you all know the answer to this. Yes, but you have to be really smart about how you take care of them, and you have to be very careful about how you take care of them. They're very cute and they're very charismatic, and a lot of them can be seen on TikTok these days, particularly axolotls, but they're really tricky to keep. They have a lot of special requirements. We're going to talk a little bit about that. And the next talk coming up is going to be all about keeping amphibians as pets. So I'm going to let that expert weigh in, and you should stay tuned for that. So how in the world can vets help amphibians? Can they even come into the clinic? What do we need to know about taking care of them? There's a lot of things to understand when you're a veterinarian to all kinds of different animals. In general, one of the biggest things to know is something called husbandry, and that's how an animal is taken care of in captivity. We need to know their anatomy and physiology, which is what's on the inside and how those things on the inside work. We need to know how to handle them to make sure that we're keeping them safe and we're not hurting them when we're examining them. And then, of course, as a doctor, you got to know their diseases and how to treat them. Husbandry is one of the first ones I want to talk about. The next talk, again, is going to talk all about taking care of amphibians as pets. So you're going to get even more information in there. One of the biggest struggles that I run into as a veterinarian who sees amphibians is that we don't know a lot about how to take care of them the best in captivity. A lot of the things that they come into the veterinary hospital for can be traced back to just not providing them the best care for them. And people usually say that they're doing their absolute best, and I believe them, but some of these species, it's just really, really hard to get right. Some of the basic parts of amphibian husbandry that we need to consider are water quality, or how all the chemicals are balanced in their water, what life stage or life stages you're keeping, because when we think about amphibians, right, they live in two very different worlds when they're babies versus when they're adults. So what life stage are you keeping, and do you have everything they need for that life stage? Do they have a heat source? Do they even need a heat source? And what kind of substrate are you keeping them on? Substrate is what's on the bottom of their cage. A lot of amphibians like to burrow, and we need to make sure that they can get down underneath the soil and that that soil is safe for them too. We need to consider where we're getting the water for their enclosure, and if you're putting any chemicals in it, or if you're getting it from your well, is there any chlorine in it? Particularly because these guys like really damp environments, we need to pay attention to their humidity. And finally, their temperature. Again, do they need a heat source? Do they not need a heat source? Is their cage by a draft or an air conditioner? I like to put this little picture in because this tiny little friend had something sticking out of his rear end. And when I pulled a little bit, everything that's in the red box came out. And this is called sphagnum moss. and it was in the bottom of his enclosure. And he'd taken a big bite of his food and got a big bite of moss too. So once we got that out, he was feeling a lot better, but I told his owners they need to feed him in a separate spot after this. I wanted to talk a little bit about water quality because it's so important for amphibians. Every amphibian is a little different in what they require, but this is basically how water in a tank changes when animals are in there. So we start out by giving them food, if a fish dies, if bacteria grows on their gravel, and our little friend, the axolotl here, will eat these things and it'll turn into poop. Poop in amphibians and in fish comes out as ammonia. Ammonia is really, really toxic and can make fish and amphibians very sick. So that's when we rely on two different kinds of bacteria to help us. Nitrosomonas is the first one, who helps turn ammonia into nitrites. Nitrites are a little less toxic, still not great though. Nitrobacter turns our nitrites into nitrates. Nitrates are probably the only thing we want to see when we test our water. Nitrates can get used by plants to make more oxygen and to photosynthesize. And then when you change water, you can take the nitrates out without too much of a big deal. For most amphibians, you don't want any ammonia in your water at all. You want very low or completely absent nitrites. A little bit of nitrates is okay. You also want to make sure you don't have any chlorine in your water because that can be really toxic. Temperature, dissolved oxygen, pH, all of that changes with the kind of amphibian that you're keeping. So that's going back to husbandry, making sure you know that you're doing things the right way for your pet. Let's talk about anatomy. This is fun. Amphibians have what's called a tetrapod body plan, which means 4 legs. Pretty easy, right? Tetra, 4. They also have a 3-chambered heart. Mammals have 4 chambers. So amphibians, blood mixes in one part of their chamber and gets sent back out. But thankfully, they're so good at oxygenating that that's not a big deal. Like we talked about, amphibians have both terrestrial and aquatic life stages. That's what makes them an amphibian. Amphibians also have a segmented skull, which means that there's joints throughout their skull that can help them open really wide and swallow really big food. They can regenerate their teeth, and they have a huge oral cavity, which just basically means a big mouth. Time for a fun fact. If you've ever seen a frog do this, where he pulls his eyes back in, they can use their eyes to help push really large meals down their throats into their stomachs. So this guy's just taking a big swallow. He might have just eaten a really big insect or a snail, who knows? But this is a really good way to help them swallow. We're getting there. Let's talk about physiology. So remember, anatomy is what's going on the inside, and physiology is how those things work. Amphibian skin is really, really important. So important that I gave it a whole slide. Amphibian skin has what's called high permeability, and that means that water can flow back and forth across the skin really easily. As a veterinarian, that's really helpful because we can administer medication topically on their skin, and we can even use it to help them resuscitate themselves with fluid. So if they're dehydrated, you can put them in a soak and they can help rehydrate themselves. There's 2 different kinds of glandular tissue in their skin, and I know this is getting a little technical, but it's pretty important. Along their back, they have what's called mucus glands, which secretes slime, basically. And this slime helps them keep all of that water in, because if they're really permeable, it would happen that maybe fluid can leave them if they're in a warm environment. Mucus helps seal everything in. Underneath, there are granular glands, which are larger and have more functions to them. Some of them are toxic, and some of them can help with mating and pheromones. And larger toads even have a spot on their bellies called the drinking patch, where they can absorb water even better. The really cool thing is that amphibian skins can also be a secondary source of respiration, which means that they can exchange gas and oxygen, carbon dioxide across their skin. They can breathe through their skin. It's pretty awesome. Amphibians are amazing, amazing healers. Salamanders in particular, because that's who we're talking about this week, can regrow amputated toes and fingers, limbs, and even their tails. In a lot of other groups, tadpoles can have regenerative ability. So if they get injured, they can regrow something before they metamorphose into adults. Once they're adults, though, they don't usually retain that ability. If we're ever doing surgery on an amphibian, we have to be really careful because their skin can get really, really inflamed. So inflamed is when you fall and your scrape gets really red and puffy and it hurts. That's inflammation. Amphibians really like to get inflammation. We have to be careful about what kind of suture we use because the sutures that break down cause a huge reaction, and that can be even worse in amphibians. And the same thing for fish. Down at the bottom is a salamander that's regrown its entire foot over a period of a couple of months, which is pretty amazing. So this is the same salamander. They just took pictures at little intervals.
Yeah, that is amazing to see. And I have a question for you because I have heard, again, when I mentioned that I really want to work with axolotls because I think they're really cool. I've heard that axolotls have been able to regenerate like parts of their brain and their nervous system. Is that correct?
So I've heard that too.
Okay.
Very interesting. And that's some high level regeneration that I think not every amphibian can do. But
it's
axolotls,
like a superpower.
Yeah, it really is. Axolotls are getting used a lot as laboratory animals. So laboratory animal vets and the animals themselves have such an important job in helping us study new drugs and stay safe. Things like vaccinations get tested that way, and vets make sure that those animals are taken care of the best. So we're learning so much more about axolotls as they show us things like that in the lab.
All right, very cool. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, so we're talking about amphibian healing, and I wanted to give everybody a little warning in case your belly's a little squeamish. I do have pictures of a wound that are coming up. I promise there's no blood, and there's nothing super gross, but there's also a video of a worm getting pulled out. And so I'm going to give you a second, and if you feel a little squeamish, you can look away and just listen, and I'll let you know when we're all done. All right, I'm going to count down so everybody can look away if you need to. 3, 2, 1. Ready? All right. So this is a little White's tree frog, and she came in because she had these lumps and injuries all over her body. I opened up one of these little lumps to see what's inside, and I pulled out a tapeworm. You can see that she has another injury on her other leg. We can play it one more time just in case anybody's really into it. So here we are. We opened up that little injury. We can see it. And here comes the tapeworm. Oof. The great news is that once we got these all out, she did really well with healing. We treated her topically, gave her some antibiotics, and these pictures are taken over about a week. So this was Patty, and Patty did really well. Just to show you that this can happen in a clinic too, not even in a lab.
Yeah, and I have a question. So when I think of tapeworms, I think of like them being in digestive tracts and things like that. How were you able to pull it out of her leg? Was it just in a different location?
So most tapeworms do have part of their life cycle, at least, that goes through the digestive tract. Okay. This particular kind of tapeworm gets ingested exactly the way you would think of tapeworms kind of getting their start. And then from the digestive tract, it actually migrates its way through all the way until it gets to the skin. And there's a couple of tapeworms that do that too. Some hang out just in the muscle, and this particular one likes to go all the way to just under the skin. So tapeworms have a job to do. Parasites have a job to do, and that's to make lots of eggs and get passed on and infect more animals or people. The way some tapeworms do that is to come out in the poop. And the way these guys do it is to burst out through the skin.
All right. Well, I think it's really cool.
Parasites are very, very cool. I know it's kind of gross.
Yeah. Very interesting though. Thank you.
In that last video, you may have seen that I was wearing gloves to hold Patty. Gloves are one of the most important things when handling an amphibian patient. And that's because we can have things like hand sanitizer, soap, or lotion on our hands that our amphibian patients can absorb through their skin, can make them really sick. We also want to make sure that we're using dechlorinated water, just like you do with your fish. You have to rinse all of the surfaces that you're handling your patient on, because you never know who could have cleaned it last. And you always want to weigh them on a wet paper towel, because they like to jump and they like to boing away, and hopefully we can let them sit. You want to be very, very gentle, supporting their pelvis and avoiding pulling on their legs or their arms too much. And as a reminder, they're very slippery. Some of your patients can also practice what's called caudal autotomy, which means when they're really scared, they can drop their own tail. Remember that our salamanders and our newts, they can regrow those. It costs them a lot in terms of energy and fat storage. So you may set them back a little bit, particularly if they're trying to heal. But if it happens, it's not the end of the world. And just in case you needed a reminder, every good veterinarian knows, don't lick your patients. It's very important in toads in particular to not lick your patient, because a lot of them have hallucinogens or toxins in their skin. If you lick that, it can make you see some weird things, and in some cases it can even kill you. So we laugh a little bit, but it's very serious. We use pretty much all of our other senses as veterinarians. So you think about sight and touch, but we do use some smell. We obviously hear. We don't taste our patients. Remember that, veterinarians. The last thing to remember as an amphibian veterinarian is something called zoonosis. So zoonosis is a disease that can pass from your patient to you. In a lot of cases, they can make you really sick. There's things like salmonella and mycobacterium, which can affect your GI tract and your skin. There's some tapeworms, right, Sam? These are the few kinds of tapeworms that can affect people that are pretty gross. And then there's other protozoa like Giardia. You may have heard some of these terms talking about other animals, talking about drinking water. They're out there in the environment, but we still need to make sure we're taking good care of ourselves. Time for another question. If you could choose to grow, drop, and then regrow a tail, or have gills on your head, or be able to drink all your own water through your skin, what do you think you would pick? What about you, Sam?
I feel like I'm very heavily biased toward axolotls during this program. I would want gills, because being able to swim underwater would be so fabulous and not have to worry about like going up and having to take a breath. You could just keep on swimming underwater.
I agree. Whenever we play that game of what would be your superpower, my answer is always breathe underwater. And so I think having gills, not only are they very stylish, you know, I have curly hair already, so I think it wouldn't be too far off to look like gills, but I think they're really cute, and it would be awesome to get to breathe underwater too.
Yeah, I agree. I think that would be fabulous. Yeah, we're waiting on if we hear anyone's responses in chat. But yeah, again, I feel like I'm very biased toward axolotls. I mean, they're awesome salamanders, so.
They are, and we're still in the same group, right? So it's okay.
Exactly.
We're not too biased against salamanders. I would hope that nobody's out there hurting themselves to the point where you have to regrow a tail or regrow a limb. But
that's true.
If you're in the kind of work where that might happen, that would probably be pretty handy.
That's true. Oh, Allie said in chat that they would like to drink water through their skin because you would never be dehydrated again.
That's a great point, Allie. Sometimes when I'm working, I forget to drink my water and I get a headache by the end of the day. It would be nice just to be able to sit in a bathtub and absorb all my water.
I'm all good. Yeah, that would be wonderful.
If you guys have any more answers, feel free to put them in. We can talk about them at the end too. So we're getting there. Now we're trying to learn about what can make amphibians sick. There's a lot of things, and I'm not going to read all of these off. Just know that there's bacteria and fungus. There's also viruses and parasites. We saw a parasite earlier in that video. That was the first one on the list there, Spargana. And that disease is called sparginosis. It's one of my favorite things to see in the practice. And usually the frogs do okay afterwards. So I feel all right saying that's my favorite. We're going to start talking about a few bacterial diseases, and I want you to kind of store these in the back of your mind because they might be important for later. The first one is one of the most common things we hear from owners of amphibians, a disease called red leg. The fancy term for red leg is bacterial dermatosepticemia, a bacterial infection of the skin. When this happens, we see edema, which is swelling and puffiness, erythema, which is redness, and lethargy, which is just being really tired. Usually when we see it, it's on the hind limbs and the ventrum, which is the belly. And we can get a bunch of different kinds of bacteria out of this. When we think we have a case of red leg, one of the first things to do is to check the water quality, talk to their owners about any stressors that might have happened, and then consider if there's any predisposing infections. So did our amphibian patient injure a toe recently or get a cut? Anything else that could cause the bacteria to get into their skin. In order to diagnose it, we usually start with cytology, which is getting a sample of those cells and examining it under the microscope. If we can get enough blood to do it, a blood culture is also ideal. And that's when we send a blood sample off to the lab, they put it on a bacterial growth plate, and we see what comes out. So that way we know exactly what bacteria is causing the problem. These are usually treated with antibiotics, and in some cases they need an antifungal as well. These guys love to live in the dirt, and that means that there's fungus and bacteria living out there, and they're opportunistic. So if they see an opening to start getting in there, they will. These paintbrush kind of lesions that we can see on the mouth and on the arms and toes of our little friend here are pretty characteristic of this red leg disease. It almost looks like someone took a little bit of watercolor paint and just brushed it on gently. Chytrid is a big bad one that we see more in frogs than we do in salamanders, but we're starting to see some effects there. This is mostly skin lesions, and it causes something called hyperkeratosis, which means that keratin top layer of the skin gets thicker and thicker and thicker. And that's kind of that gray appearance that we see in them. People describe them as looking kind of cloudy. They usually get secondary infections, and particularly in Australia and the Americas, we can see massive die-offs of groups of frogs or other amphibians in one area where an outbreak has happened. You can diagnose this via bacterial test called PCR or cytology, and it's what's called a notifiable disease to veterinarians, which means if we diagnose it, we have to let the authorities know. That's how big of a deal it is. Right now, the best thing we can do is a bath with a medication called itraconazole, but increasing the temperature can also really help them fight it off. This is the kind of fungus that likes to live at a very specific temperature range. And so if your amphibian can tolerate it, bumping up the temperature really helps. Mycobacteriosis is tricky because it's in the environment and it's everywhere. We can see fish get myco, we can see amphibians get myco, it's kind of everywhere. Classically, we see a condition called ulcerative pododermatitis, which means these big ouchies on the bottom of the feet. But we can also see something similar to this, which it almost looks like scrapes and bumps. It's an ulcer, and the inside gets really inflamed and kind of granular. Myco is different from something like chytrid because these animals usually waste away, meaning that they get really skinny and they slow down and they don't feel good over a long period of time. It's more chronic as opposed to acute. We can diagnose this again with cytology. So all we have to do sometimes is just press a microscope slide on a lesion and stain it, and we can see. We can also do specific stains and a culture. Of course, when everybody thinks about amphibians, they think about things in the environment that can affect them too. Toxins are a big deal. One of the biggest are pesticides. And so when you're treating your lawn, if you have kind of a nice native environment with lots of reptiles and amphibians and birds and insects, you have to be really careful about what you put down there. This can be treated in the veterinary clinic if we get to it fast enough, but there's a lot of other problems that could come along with it. And usually it's too late by the time they get to us. People who take really good care of their animals can still fall victim to this if they go out to their yard and it's been recently treated and they bring in something like a branch or a leaf as enrichment for their pet, but there's that chemical on there. That super permeable skin means that everything soaks right in and gets absorbed really fast. Poor water quality can cause a lot of problems. Water that wasn't dechlorinated or is really dirty and has a lot of bacteria growing in it can cause secondary issues. Metabolic bone disease is a condition where the diet's not right, so the body needs more calcium. The best source of calcium inside the body is the bones. So the body sends out little sentinels to pull all that calcium out of the bones and replaces it with fibrous tissue, which means the bones become really bendy and can't support their weight very well. And that can affect their GI tracts and their heart and all kinds of things too. And then vitamin B deficiency can cause things like scoliosis and poor skin. Again, usually goes back to them not being fed the right way. There are some non-infectious causes of disease, and I wanted to show you a little case that I had. One of the more common ones is a condition called ascites, which can also be called edema or bloat. Ascites just means that the body's filling up with fluid. We can see it in response to water quality, but in little frogs like these African clawed frogs, it's more in response to the fact that their livers aren't working very well. Sometimes they can look really bloated because they've eaten something they shouldn't too. Remember, those large oral cavities means that they take all kinds of stuff in. So I have two frogs here, and you can see that one looks a little bit different from the other. His owners brought him in, and when I took him out wearing my gloves, he looked like he'd been blown up like a little balloon, the poor guy. He looks very concerned too. He looks very worried. So what we were able to do is to use a very tiny needle and to go in and pull some of this out, because I wanted to know, it's probably not air because he's not floating at the top, but is it fluid? And in the fluid, can I see any indication that it's a bacterial infection or it's related to his heart or his liver? That's how much fluid I was able to pull out of this tiny, tiny little guy. That's about 5 cc's of fluid. And to give you an idea, before we started, he weighed about 6 grams. And when I was done, he weighed about 1 gram. So this is him afterwards. He looks so much happier. He looks relieved. And we put him back with his friend, and pretty soon we couldn't even tell who was who. So he needed some other treatments after this. Just taking out the fluid wasn't enough, but he felt a lot better when we took that out. They can also get constipated and they can get impacted, again, because they eat something they shouldn't have, or sometimes they eat the substrate. I've seen little frogs get weighed down all the way to the bottom of the tank, and the owner will say, they can't swim around. I don't know what happened. And we can take a little x-ray and see that there's a piece of their aquarium gravel in them. So that happens to you. You have to be very careful. Okay, I think we've gotten all of our base knowledge now, and the last thing we need to learn is how in the world do we even evaluate a case? So we're going to walk through a case together, and then after that, it's going to be your turn, and I want to hear what your diagnosis is. So this is Monroe, the Pac-Man frog. Monroe hadn't pooped in a couple of weeks. He was owned by a really good caretaker. She was a technician of mine. She took excellent care of him. And he even volunteered to go through our CT scanner when we first got one. So he was spoiled and a frequent flyer at our hospital. His owner had already tried to massage his belly. She'd tried soaking him. She'd tried different foods. A bunch of things had happened before Monroe got to me, everything except pooping. So one of the first things I did was think, could this be some dirt? Could this be a foreign body? Pac-Man frogs are known for these big, huge mouths that they have. So a lot of times they eat something they shouldn't have. So I decided to do an ultrasound to check what his belly looked like. And you can see the word coelomic there. Coelomic is a term that we use to describe the abdomen and the chest in animals that don't have a diaphragm. So we can say thorax or abdomen if they have a diaphragm separating it. Coelom is kind of the word for everything. So we did basically a whole body ultrasound on this kid. And the way to avoid getting any gel on him or hurting him was I put him in a Ziploc bag. We scanned him right through the bag, and he did great. I was able to see that his GI tract was intact. He didn't have any gas or foreign material in his abdomen or his coelom itself. And he didn't have a pattern that was consistent with complete obstruction of his GI tract. So stuff could move through a little bit, but mostly what I saw was a lot of foreign material sitting right near the exit door, but not quite on its way out. So now it's time to brainstorm. One of the most fun things about my job is coming up with unusual solutions for unusual problems in unusual pets. So I had a couple of options. I could go to the books, which is something that I do a lot, look in our textbooks, look in our formulary, try and figure out what I can try. Or I can ask my staff and my husband what helps them when they're in the situation, which basically means I got a second opinion. I did both. Sam, do you have any idea what I might have found that correlated with both of those things? Caffeine.
Yeah, I was going to say, I have no idea.
So caffeine was in our medical book too, as a suggestion. So things like coffee and tea. We know that caffeine can cause increased nerve activity, and we know that it can cause GI tract contractions. In humans, the effect is about 60% stronger than just drinking a glass of water, and caffeinated stuff is about 23% stronger than decaf. So we know there's a real effect there.
Nice.
We also think that maybe increasing the acidity by consuming a caffeinated drink can increase the secretion of a hormone called gastrin, which increases the speed of digestion and gastric emptying, which just means your stomach says, I got to get everything out, and everything starts moving really fast. I was also thinking that, okay, amphibians have this high skin permeability. So instead of trying to convince Monroe to drink a cup of coffee, maybe I can work around that. I started to decide that maybe we should just brew him a cup of tea. When you think about it, black tea can be really astringent, which means it can be really drying. We don't want that for really delicate amphibian skin. It can also have strange pH, and we know that coffee is the same. So my solution was to find a cup of green tea. And unfortunately, they don't make frog fart tea. So what I had to do was go around to everybody in my hospital and ask everyone to find any bag of tea they might have had in their locker or in the break room. I laid them all out and tried to figure out which one would be the best for Monroe. And I settled on a cup called Joy in the hopes that that would encourage him. We also put him in a very uplifting mug in the hopes that that would help as well. So I brewed a very cool, weak cup of tea for Monroe and sat him in it. And we had to watch Monroe for signs of being overly caffeinated, which if any parents are watching, probably know exactly what that feels like. So a little jittery, things are racing, you want to move super fast. And sure enough, at one point, Monroe hopped right out of his mug and started hopping along the treatment table. And so we decided that he'd had enough caffeine. We did a little belly massage, and we got some poop. And when we look at this poop, because that's part of my job, I got the poop out, but now I have to look at it. The poop itself had tons of insect exoskeletons. So that's the hard, crunchy shell around insects. This guy had had a really big meal of a new crunchy insect, and it had constipated him. The great news is that he did really, really well afterwards, and this wasn't a problem again. I think he learned his lesson. But sometimes being a veterinarian, you got to think out of the box a little bit, and putting a frog in a soak of tea, I think qualifies. Okay. Even if you didn't guess putting it in a cup of tea, I think you did a good job, and it's time to meet our patient. Is everybody ready? All right. Everybody meet Ned the tiger salamander. Everyone say, hi, Ned. Hi, Ned. He is an eastern tiger salamander, and they have very cute faces, as you can see. Part of the reason I picked him, just like an axolotl. All right, are you guys ready? This is Ned's history. Ned's owners brought him into the veterinarian because he hasn't been eating very much, and his owners noticed some red spots and some puffiness on his legs. It's only been going on for about 3 days, but Ned's owners take really good care of him. They looked online and they found you, a real live salamander veterinarian. So now I have a question for you guys. What are you going to be asking Ned's owners about his husbandry to make sure you have all the information that you need?
Yeah, that's a great question. And while we are waiting for our questions to be put in chat, we did have a comment. Allie in chat was saying was saying that she loves your tattoo, your snail tattoo.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah. And Miranda was saying that Eliza, my almost 2-year-old, just pointed at the screen and said, "Mommy, ew." for the toad.
That sounds like what my kids say too. They ask me about what I did at work, and then usually they hit a limit where they say, okay, that's enough. Like, we don't want to anymore.
I still love that picture though of the toad in the mug with the little, again, uplifting message of we can do this.
You want to be encouraging, right?
Exactly.
Positivity and tea seem to be
Yes.
right.
Yes, agreed. Okay, so in the chat, Ali was saying that one thing that they would ask for was inflammation, asking about inflammation. And then does he have scratches from habeata? I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly. Yeah, that's great. Oh, and there's a question of how old is Ned as well? Asking about ages. Yeah, so learning more about your patient a little bit.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So here's some information that you got out of Ned's owners, asking about his age, asking about how he's kept, and if he's had any recent injuries are all great ways to start interviewing your client. Ned's husbandry is really, really good. He lives in a 20-gallon tank and he doesn't have a UVB light. These guys don't usually need UVB, so that's not a big deal. A lot of our reptiles do, so sometimes people hear that and get a little nervous, but salamanders don't need UVB light. He uses sphagnum moss and not peat moss, which is very important because peat moss can be acidic. So these owners did their homework, which I love. He has a water bowl that he can soak himself in, which is usually kept very clean and filled with dechlorinated water. However, Ned's owners did recently go out of town and they had a pet sitter who didn't realize that she needed to change his water. And like any good amphibian, reptile, anybody else, except hopefully you listening at home, he likes to poop in his water bowl. So he pooped in his water bowl and the pet sitter didn't know she needed to clean it. Ned had been soaking in some pretty yucky water for a little while. There haven't been any new foods, no chances of him hurting himself, and there isn't any new tank equipment that he could have scratched himself on. His owners know to handle Ned very carefully, and the way they clean their tank doesn't involve any chemicals. There's no chance of any toxin exposure. He's about 4, so great question. And we know that they can live about 10 to 15 years in captivity. There's been reports of them getting 25, so they can live a long time. Ned was also captive bred, which is something we didn't ask about, but it's important to think about because sometimes animals that are wild caught can not only impact the local population, but they can come into captivity with parasites and infections that they may have contracted in the wild, and they can actually take a long time to kind of rear their head. So it's good to know where he came from. Ned eats a variety of salamander appropriate things like frozen thawed pinky mice, worms, snails, crickets, all kinds of good stuff. Everything again comes from a clean source. No chance that he got into anything bad.
Yeah, and I was going to say, people in the chat were bringing that up too. What do you feed Ned? What is Ned's habitat like? What kind of water do you use, and do you treat it? So yeah, there's some great vet minds in our audience.
Great work, doctors. You're doing awesome already. So let's go over Ned's physical exam. A good physical exam goes from the nose to the tail and everything in between. Here's a picture of Ned. We're going to pretend that that hand has gloves on it because it's supposed to. Overall, you can see that Ned's in really good body condition. He's a good size for his age and for his sex. He is a male. And we know that his eyes, his oral cavity, and his nares, or his nostrils, are all completely normal. You didn't see any extra redness, anything sticking out. He's not squinting his eyes that might indicate pain. He's comfortable when you palpate his belly. It doesn't feel like it's distended with fluid or anything else. And he doesn't have any obvious masses. He doesn't act like you're hurting him when you're touching him, besides the base level of a salamander not liking being touched, which is their prerogative. You do notice that he has red toes and forelimbs on the inner rear legs and on his belly. So everything's a little flushed. His toes and his distal legs, so those kind of outer sides of his legs, look a little swollen to you. He doesn't have any open lesions, ulcers, cuts, signs of injury, besides looking a little flushed and a little uncomfortable. He's also a little quieter than you'd expect him to be. Tiger salamanders are really outgoing and they tend to like people. They get to know the people who are taking care of them. And the fact that he's not sassing you a little bit and kind of letting you examine him tells you that he just might not be feeling good. So to recap, we have some redness and some swelling on his feet. We don't have any open ulcers. He's not eating great, and he recently had some yucky water. So I'm going to narrow it down for you guys between these two diseases. And then I want to know what everybody's diagnosis is. So feel free to write it in the chat as we're going over stuff. The big two that I'm going to narrow you down to, one is mycobacteriosis and the other is red leg. So the differences between those two are recapped here. Myco has very focal or localized lesions. The wounds are open, really swollen. They can have some dry, kind of yucky material in them. And the disease tends to progress really slow. The owners can tell you, he's looked really skinny for a while, and then I just noticed these lesions. They also tend to be just on the bottom of the feet. And you can see kind of this lack of body condition, lack of appetite for a while. Red leg, on the other hand, again, looks more like somebody took a brush with a little bit of watercolor paint and just put it on the skin in a couple of targeted areas, usually the belly, the toes, the feet. Usually those lesions aren't open, so they're not ulcerated. Often we get some edema and swelling. And in the history, we can hear things like issues with the water quality, an injury, or some kind of other exposure. Red leg also sets in really quickly. So there isn't a lot of time between when people notice something's wrong and they come into you. I'm ready to hear what everybody else's diagnosis is.
All right, so based on these, I'm thinking that my diagnosis would probably be red leg.
I like that idea. I think that makes sense. Right?
But we'll see what other people think if they agree as well. Okay, Allie is saying red leg matches the speed of progression and the babysitter problems.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So we've got one other for red leg, so two for red leg.
Solid for red leg.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think it. Oh, look at that.
You did it. You guys are awesome.
Oh, we got a third for red leg too. Yeah.
Oh, good.
Round of applause. Yeah.
So you use all the tools at your disposal, including the history and your cytology, and you figured out that it's bacterial dermatosepticemia, a red leg. You prescribed Ned a good tank cleaning with no chemicals, hand feeding until his appetite comes back, and some antibiotics that we're just going to drip on his skin for him to absorb. You come back in 2 weeks and he's doing fantastic because Ned and his parents have listened to their veterinarian's recommendations and taken good care of him. Ned has a big smile back on his face and he feels much, much better. So great job, everybody. That officially means that you are a pretend doctor of veterinary medicine. I do have to let you know that this means that you can't actually practice veterinary medicine, but the link to your brand new certificate is going to be in the YouTube chat at the end of our talk, so you can print it out and hang it on your fridge if you want. And just as a note to anybody out there who's watching, if you think you want to be a veterinarian, it's a tough road, but work hard, study what makes you excited, and do your very best. And maybe one day I'll see you in the hospital. I'm ready to talk. If anybody has questions or concerns, and there's some axolotls just for you there, Sam.
Thank you. It's like you knew.
It's so cute.
I love them so much. They're so cool. But I do know, that they have very specific like husbandry requirements. They usually like the really cold water and things like that too. Absolutely. So yeah. All right. Okay. So yes, I did post in the chat your pretend doctor of vet medicine certificate, so feel free to click on that link and you can download it and print it out and maybe put it on the fridge.
Very important stuff. And it was signed by Monroe the pooping frog too, so it's legit.
Perfect. Yes, definitely. Yeah, those frog prints, wonderful. We have a question: how many times can amphibians regrow their body parts?
That's a really good question. I don't know that there's a specific limit, like a number. It depends more on where the injury happens, how they're doing when the injury occurs. So we talked about, particularly with dropping the tail, that it can be really expensive for them, because it takes a lot of resources to regrow that. So instead of focusing on becoming reproductively active or generating eggs or hunting for prey, they're focused on regrowing that limb. And so, I don't know that there's a set number. It's as long as they're in good body condition and they have the space and time and safety to do it, I would imagine almost indefinitely. I would say eventually it's probably going to lose some of those characteristics. So the toes may start to look a little blunted, or the foot may not be as, the same normal shape. But as far as I know, there isn't really a limit, which is pretty cool.
Yeah. I was gonna say it probably depends on how many like resources they have, if they can, safely regrow and regenerate things. Allie was wondering, how many patients do you see a day?
So I have 3 jobs right now. So when I'm working in the clinic, usually we see anywhere from 15 to 20 patients a day. When I'm doing my 2 house call jobs, it's usually 1 to 2 patients a day, but I'm driving in between places and spending more time there. So it's a huge variety. And I get to see lots of different kinds of things too. So the amphibians and the fish are some of my favorite, but I also get to see small mammals like rabbits and guinea pigs, snakes and lizards and birds of all kinds. We were talking about chickens earlier, so I can get to see chickens, pigs sometimes. Oh, gosh, all kinds of stuff. I've seen some spiders, which I really like. I think they're really good patients.
Yeah. Like tarantula spiders?
Yeah.
Oh, awesome. Absolutely. That's really cool. Yeah, I feel like that'd be a lot of fun to just like go around and meet all these different animals, again with interesting diagnoses, right?
That's right.
Different cases.
I think about that too, that particularly exotic medicine requires a really creative brain. And so I like to tell people that if you think that your brain functions a little differently, or if you're different in any way, we might really need you. And so, don't let anybody tell you can't do it, because you can. You absolutely can. And if you ever need a pep talk, you let me know and I'll give you one. But it takes out of the box thinking and creativity and teamwork, and it's just really fun. It's really fun. Yeah. It's tough, but it's fun.
Yeah, definitely. And I had a question for you. Did you always want to become a vet?
So I did want to be a veterinarian when I was a little girl. And then I thought that I wanted to do research for a while. I worked with cuttlefish and with octopuses, and thought that I wanted to just be, some kind of researcher and maybe do a PhD or something. And then when I was working with my cuttlefish, I figured out that I didn't really like the data gathering part of it, but I really loved taking care of them. I loved it. And they would scrape themselves up and I'd have to treat that. And that, I just kind of stumbled back onto that passion. And for me, being a veterinarian, it ticks a lot of boxes. It's challenging and it's creative and it requires a lot of empathy, and it's fun. Every day that I work is a puzzle that I get to solve. And so I really like that.
Yeah, that's amazing. That's great to hear. I also love cuttlefish too. They're also one of my favorites. So their camouflage abilities, so cool. Yeah.
They're pretty good. They're scary smart. They are very smart. So.
That's from just cephalopods in general, like octopuses and things like that. Yeah. Heard of them solving lots of puzzles and things.
Yeah.
And escape artists.
Yeah. The octopus that I worked with, I used to have to put textbooks and duct tape all around his tank. And one time I came in and he was peeling the silicone lining off of his tank and letting it go into the current and then snatching it back right before it just got out of his reach. So I had to reseal his tank and I had to seal everything up. And yeah, it's like having a toddler forever.
Yeah.
Or for their whole lifespan.
That's amazing. Wow. All right. Okay. Well, I am not seeing any more questions in the chat. So I do want to say thank you so much, Ashley, for speaking with us and telling us all of your cool stories and things like that, like all the cool cases that you worked on, and letting us be a vet and diagnosing ourselves. And thank you all for tuning into this talk. We hope you had fun being a vet. And as always, thank you to our museum members who help make events like Reptile and Amphibian Days possible. If you join or renew your membership during this event, you'll get a free Reptile and Amphibians Days t-shirt. And today is sadly our last day of Reptile and Amphibian Days, but there are still other great programs scheduled throughout the day. So if you want to check those out and register for those, you can see those. And even though it's the last day, all of these programs will be available again on our YouTube through our playlist and things like that. So you can revisit all of your favorite programs when you want to re-watch those. And thank you again so much for attending. and we hope you have a great rest of your day.
Bye. Thank you.